This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 583 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the mailbag questions this week, I want to let you know that we've got another listener league this week for FanDuel Podcast Network listeners. Check out FanDuel.com/league/listener league to join. It's a rake-free contest that costs $5 to enter and has $1,500 in prizes. You can enter up to 3 lineups to the contest. Again, that's FanDuel.com/league/listener league to join. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. The first question this week is from @Shane_Larkin10. Hey JJ, thanks for all the content. You're welcome. AJ Brown is projected as a possibly top 3 wide receiver going forward. But with no other formidable threats in Tennessee, including Julio, won't defenses just key in on him? Is this a sell-high opportunity to add depth at another position before the playoffs? So I haven't done a study on this. I haven't looked specifically at what happens when a player becomes the sole weapon in a passing attack after his teammates get hurt. I think a study like that would probably have plenty of flaws and would have to make a ton of assumptions. But I've never done one. The bottom line with this kind of thing is that fantasy managers always approach it from 2 different angles. The first angle is how you're approaching it with this question, that if a player is left as a top target without much support, then defenses can just focus on that player and take him out of games. The other angle is that if the player is now the sole target in that offense, he's going to see more volume, or he has a chance to. And I generally lean that way because we know that targets correlate strongly to fantasy output. I also think people generally overstate how often players get double teamed, or how often these players are put in some terrible situations. And that's especially true if we're talking about really talented guys like AJ Brown. Like, you could use that same logic with Devontae Adams. But Adams is a beast, so he gets fed. So I wouldn't overthink it. AJ Brown is someone that you want on your fantasy roster. This next question is from @Pitt to the SB. Not sure if this counts as start-sit, but what's going on with Manny Sanders? Have his peripherals changed significantly, or has he just had a couple of down weeks? Well, his peripherals have changed, but not all of his peripherals. What I mean by that is, yes, Emmanuel Sanders has seen less volume in recent weeks. Over his first 6 games, Sanders averaged a target share per game of about 18%. Over his last 3, that's been under 12%. He went from 6.5 targets per game to 4.7. That's the bad news. He hasn't given you many good performances because of this. The good news is that his deeper peripherals haven't changed. His snap share last week was a little bit lower than normal, but that probably had a lot to do with game script. Because when you look at Pro Football Focus's routes run data, Sanders ran 25 routes last week. Stephon Diggs ran 29. And Gabriel Davis was the next highest with 12 routes. Cole Beasley's been apparently playing a little bit less because of his ribs injury. The week prior, Sanders actually led the Bills in routes run against the Jags. And then the week before that against Miami, same deal. He ran the most routes for the Bills. So I wouldn't be too concerned. If anything, I might consider Sanders a buy candidate right now. The next question is from @FantasyQuasars. Hi JJ, how do you view Miles Sanders' outlook coming back? You called him a buy before the injury, but the Eagles seem likely to use a committee. Thanks a lot, love the show. Yeah, I'm not going to lie, it's pretty frustrating that I called Miles Sanders a buy, he gets hurt immediately, and then the Eagles go to a more run-heavy approach. Sanders would have smashed if he never got hurt. But that's fantasy football for you. I'm still cool with Miles Sanders. I just have a fear that Philadelphia is going to see the success that Jordan Howard has had, and they're going to put Sanders in more of a committee. Part of the allure with Sanders before his injury was that he was starting to see a huge portion of that Philadelphia backfield. That now has a chance to change. He's the kind of player that you take on, though, if you're needing more variance on your roster. If you're worried about making the playoffs but need some upside. I do think that there is some risk, though, that Sanders is not going to see the same type of backfield share that he was seeing before his injury. And that could really sink his fantasy upside. This next question says, Hi JJ, I'm stuck with what to do with TJ Hockenson. I'm hesitant to drop him, but also think there is no value for a trade. I want nothing to do with the Lions' passing attack. Is it just time to move on? I feel like the TJ Hockenson backlash after week 10, I feel like it's been kind of insane. Yes, he had a terrible game. Not only did the Lions do nothing through the air, but Hockenson had one target and he didn't score a single fantasy point. But he had scored double-digit PPR points across his 3 previous games. Even if you include his week 10 goose egg, since week 6, he's still a top 10 tight end in PPR formats. He scored more fantasy points than Darren Waller during this time. I don't think dropping TJ Hockenson is a good idea. He has a 20.4% target share in the season. He's 7th in points per game, even when you include Rob Gronkowski and Dawson Knox. I mean, who are you replacing him with? He's shown that he has upside too. He's got 2 20-point games this year, and he scored 19 points against Philly back in week 8. Now, do I think Hockenson should be part of this elite tight end discussion? No. Don't take this as me saying to actively trade for TJ Hockenson. But it seems like people are way too low on him. Like he's completely worthless. Guys, the tight end position sucks. He's a lot less worthless than the majority of the players at his position in fantasy football. This next question is from @CruiseControl12. How would you rank these 3 wide receivers rest of season? Rashad Bateman, Devontae Smith, Jerry Jeudy. So I love all 3 of these guys. I've talked up each one of them at one point on a 15 transaction show this year. I'm probably going to put Devontae Smith first, then Jerry Jeudy, and then Rashad Bateman. I think all 3 of them should absolutely be rostered. I would want all 3 of them on my team. I probably like each guy more than the consensus. But Smith is in a really good spot to continue to see volume in that offense. And if and when the Eagles have a different game script, or maybe they just pass a little bit more, Smith's targets could and should rise. The Eagles also have the best schedule from here on out for wide receivers when looking at my adjusted fantasy points allowed method. Jerry Jeudy is pretty close to Smith though. The schedule isn't as nice, but Judy's going to see a similar target share in his offense more than likely. And with Bateman, I've got him last year because there are 2 really good alternatives in that Baltimore offense. I love Bateman as a player. I think that he could have really good value from here on out. But I'm going to side with Smith and Jeudy over him. This next question says, is it time to change our expectations for Amari Cooper? I mean, it obviously depends on what your expectations were to begin with. But yes, I think so. CeeDee Lamb is probably going to lead that team in target share from now through the end of the season. We have a 1-game sample with Michael Gallup back, and Amari Cooper's target share dipped to about 12% in that 1 game. Now, we obviously can't use that game and say, this is how it's going to be from now to the end of the fantasy season. But there's an actual thing that happened. Michael Gallup came back, and the response to that was negative for Amari Cooper. So it's tough to paint this as a good thing. Now, I still think Cooper is an asset that you want on your team. I would say he's more of a hold than a full-blown sell, though. But changing expectations, yes, Michael Gallup is back. It only makes sense to alter our expectations. This next question is from @RomeoOscarBravo. JJ, thanks for such a thoughtful and refreshing show. There is no better minute-for-minute podcast out there. Thanks. How would you view Gibson in Dynasty? Is he a sell based on pass-catching limitations? Do we just hope for it next year? Seems limited like Chubb without the broken tackles. So in situations like this, I try not to take current season usage and just assume it's the usage a player is going to have for the rest of his career. Because if you sold Gibson right now, you'd be doing so under the impression that he's not going to be much of a pass catcher in the NFL. I don't think that's totally logical. Gibson has a receiving background, and he wasn't even listed as a running back in college. The fact that he's done what he's done in the NFL so far is pretty remarkable. And it tells us that he's good. The fact that he's adapted so fast is a signal that he's a good football player. And at the end of the day, that's what we want to bet on in Dynasty. We want to bet on guys who are good because that will lead to more volume. And considering his background and what he did in college, I don't think it's right to assume that he's just not going to have that pass-catching role in Washington. And it's not like he's not valuable as mostly a 2-down back. He's still an RB2. But he's got plenty of upside when the pass-catching role opens up more. So I would not sell him. If anything, I might lean more buy. This next question is from @R4mate. Has the relative struggles of the top 3 drafted tight ends changed your process on drafting tight ends early? Seems like the edge of having a top tight end is harder to predict than in the past, and best to throw mid to late round darts in hopes that you hit. What does the data suggest? The data suggests that high-end tight ends have been a little bit overdrafted over the last decade. I mean that. I haven't really been a huge proponent of drafting stud tight ends early. My take for a long time, it's been that if you're gonna draft a tight end, you should either get an elite guy early or you should wait forever at the position. Because historically, middle round tight ends have been really bad. And a lot of the stuff that I talked about on episode 528 over the offseason, which was on finding breakout tight ends, it lays this out. It talks about this. I'll say this though. The fantasy football world is always way too reactive to what happens in a previous season. Strategy changes, yes, but it shouldn't change drastically year over year. It should be a slow change. Because think about it. You feeling this way about tight ends this year, it generally comes down to your feelings about Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, and George Kittle. I'd say Kelce has been fine enough this year. Maybe he's underperformed a little bit. I don't have the math done though to really say for sure. Kittle's been hurt for most of the season, and then Darren Waller has underperformed. So what does that really tell us? Should that really change your draft approach dramatically? That 3 players underperformed for various reasons. That's not really a big sample size. Instead, it's always better to look at longer-term trends. That's what I tried to do with that breakout tight end episode. And that's what I try to do with everything. Those longer-term trends have shown that middle-round tight ends generally are terrible. And I doubt we're going to see that change with this year's data. I've always leaned more late-round tight end than early-round tight end. But I've understood early-round tight ends. I get the allure. And I've drafted tight ends early at times too. But I look at these things longer term rather than what happened the previous season. It's a better way to approach strategy. This last question is from @MJPoke. Defense and special teams heading into and in the playoffs. Which team should we focus in on for the stretch run? Thanks, JJ. Love the show. Thanks for tuning in. Okay, so I got tons and tons of questions this week about playoff schedules. First off, for everyone who asks which players to buy and sell based off of playoff schedules, I try to talk about that on the 15 Transaction Show. I'll try to focus on that a little bit more over the next week or two. Now, as for defenses, let's take a look at my adjusted points allowed method. I'll tell you who the top 5 teams are when looking at weeks 15 through 17. And this is just based on schedule. The best schedule looks to be Jacksonville, which makes sense because they get Houston in week 15 and then the Jets in week 16 and then New England in week 17. I just don't know how much you're going to trust the Jags defense, but they're probably available in your league at least. Next on the list is the Chargers. They get Kansas City in week 15, then Houston, and then Denver. Kansas City is a slightly above average opponent because of their issues throughout the season. But obviously it's a risky play in week 15 because they could be playing a lot better by then if they keep doing what they did against the Raiders. But Houston and Denver are great matchups in week 16 and 17. Third is Cincinnati, but when looking at their schedule, they get the Chiefs too. And it's not as attractive subjectively. Fourth is Buffalo. The Bills get the Panthers, Patriots, and Falcons over their final 3. But obviously Buffalo is rostered in almost all leagues. And then lastly is the Seahawks. They do get the Rams in week 15, that's not great, but then they get the Bears and the Lions in week 16 and 17. Honestly, it's hard to get a defense that has everything lined up perfectly. So let's look at weeks 16 and 17 only. By doing that, Seattle jumps to number 1. Tampa Bay moves to number 2. They get the Panthers and the Jets. Number 3 is the aforementioned Chargers. And then number 4 is Buffalo before we get a drop. So hopefully that helps you guys out a little bit. Things can and will change. And that's simply based off of adjusted points allowed to opposing defenses. But I think the teams that I just talked about all make sense as stashes if that's what you're looking to do. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. Good luck in Week 11. I'll talk to you next week.